Okay, I'm going to get started. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the 2021 SCID Compass Summit. My name is Karen Rohr, and I'm the Communications Manager for the SCID Compass program of the Immune Deficiency Foundation. Here with me today are Sara Andrews, Barbara Biesecker, and Melissa Raspa of RTI International. They will be presenting on coping with the uncertainties of a SCID diagnosis. If you're interested, a PDF of the slides can be found and downloaded on this session's main page on the virtual platform agenda. A recording of this session will be uploaded to the virtual platform shortly after the session ends. If you have any questions, please send them through the chat to Sara, and she will address them at the end of the presentation. I will now turn the program over to Sara. Sara, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much. My colleagues and I are so excited to be presenting to you today. First, just like to offer the disclaimer that we are not providing any medical advice. And before we get started, as Karen mentioned, we are going to be presenting about coping with the uncertainties of a SCID diagnosis. And I'd like to give my co-presenters the opportunity to introduce themselves first before I dive in. So, Barb?
Hi, I'm Barbara Biesecker. I'm a genetic counselor by training. I have my Ph.D. in health behavior and have worked with rare diseases and
focus 105
and genetic conditions for many years. And I'm happy to be here.
Thank you. And Melissa?
Hi, everyone. I'm Melissa Raspa. I'm a senior scientist at RTI, where I direct the Genomics, Ethics, and Translational Research program, and I lead the SCID Compass team here.
Great, thanks. If everyone could please make sure you're muted, that would be great. I think we're getting some background noise from somewhere. Thank you. Oh. Okay, sorry, I got muted. Sorry about that. So, just a little bit of background on how we came to be giving this presentation. It's no surprise to anyone here that parents who receive a positive newborn screen for any condition face a myriad of uncertainties, which continue as the family goes forth and receives a diagnosis and embarks on a life that looks very different than what they may have been expecting. And this is especially true of parents of a child who screens positive for SCID through newborn screening. In our past work with SCID Compass, this became very apparent to us in a parent survey that we did and some previous interviews with parents, just how prominent and persistent uncertainties were in the SCID journey. So we set out to explore that and understand it better with the hope that being able to describe what those uncertainties are and how parents are managing them would be a way to develop resources, hopefully, to help newly diagnosed SCID parents better manage the uncertainties that they're facing getting that positive screen. So we conducted interviews with 26 parents of a child who was screened positive for SCID through newborn screening. And I should say that a few of those parents, I think about 5, actually ended up receiving a diagnosis of a SCID-like condition or a different condition, but they screened positive for SCID. So that was their initial contact. And today we're going to share some of what we learned from those interviews. I'd like to say that we are going to give examples of types of uncertainties and how parents have managed them using quotes. And this may bring up some difficult memories for some people. The reason that we think it's important to do it is that they really present powerful examples of what parents have experienced that we think will validate the experiences of other parents and also hopefully provide hope in seeing how parents have coped. So we'll give an overview of the interviews that we conducted. We're going to dig a little bit deeper. We're going to describe all of the types of certainties that we saw parents describe in the interviews, and then we're going to dig a little bit deeper into a specific type of uncertainty, which I'll describe more in a bit, called existential uncertainty. So I've mentioned, I think, this SCID journey. I think I've referred to it as the journey already so far. And some of that came out of some other interviews that we did with parents where they, outlined these approximate steps that they experienced from the time of getting that newborn screen result into, finding their way to a new normal. As I mentioned, we did interview parents who ultimately received a diagnosis that was not SCID. And so not only is this approximate journey not necessarily the journey of every SCID family, everyone's journey is different, but it may not represent, the journey of everyone who's diagnosed, who is screened positive for SCID through newborn screening. But just we did frame our conversations, our interviews with parents around this journey. And so I'll just briefly say what the stages of the journey are. Diagnosis being receiving that newborn screen test that's positive and then getting a confirmatory diagnosis. Then the pre-treatment stage, where the care team is deciding on the treatment. If it happens to be a bone marrow transplant, then that's the period where you're looking for a donor. The treatment, so if it's a bone marrow transplant, the donor's been found, any pre-treatment conditioning such as chemotherapy is administered and the treatment's provided. The post-treatment is that waiting period of 2 to 6 months, typically waiting for the treatment to take effect. And then the new normal is a long and a bit nebulous period when families are able to return home. A lot of times there's still a bit of a waiting and isolation period until the child's medically cleared to be around more people. But then, extending further years into the future when the family has sort of adopted a new way of life that incorporates SCID. So this is part of what you'll hear me mention as we talk about what we heard from parents. I do want to say, of course, that this is not necessarily, even for SCID families, a linear journey. So, you could go back from the post-treatment period to treatment, or even from the new normal to having to go back to thinking about a different treatment. So in terms of who we talked to, it was mostly mothers, but we did speak to several fathers. We also had representation of all the major types of SCID, as well as some SCID-like conditions such as DiGeorge that are picked up through the same newborn screening test. And we had representation from all of the journey stages that I just talked about. So I would say by far most of the parents we talked to were more in that new normal stage where they were home and navigating life post-treatment, but we did talk to parents who were in the diagnosis and pre-treatment and treatment stages as well. So I'm going to move in now to sharing some of our findings, first about the types of uncertainty that parents experienced. We based our analysis, we did a detailed analysis of the interviews that we did with parents, and when we were categorizing the types of uncertainty that they described, we used types of uncertainty that are part of, what's known about medical conditions and health situations. So we used some sort of existing categories that were congruent with the SCID journey as well. So the first of those is medical uncertainty. This is related to the diagnosis, trying to explain what caused the condition, the prognosis, and then the treatment recommendations. And here is a quote that exemplifies this. So this parent says, "Gene therapy, I'd never heard of it before. I didn't even know it existed. I was just having a hard time deciding if it was the right choice for her." Another type of uncertainty that we looked at was personal. So these are uncertainties related to the implications of the diagnosis on oneself and those that one is close to, so the partner and the extended family and children. And here's an example from a parent. "I think it's normal when something like this is happening that your whole attention goes to your child. And when you have a child that's sick, you forget to take time for each other and be there for each other." So this is a parent describing some uncertainty in their relationship with their spouse as a result of dealing with the SCID journey. Next is practical uncertainties. It's what it sounds like, uncertainties related to processes and structures for getting care and then providing care. So really just the day-to-day things of life to take care of the child and get care for the child. So here's an example from a parent. I would say the first year we were still trying to get used to being parents. And on top of that, we had finance issues. So that was another stress factor. So here you see just that practical uncertainty, needing to be able to finance treatment and care for the child, being part of that SCID uncertainty. And then lastly, existential uncertainty. So think about the word existential, sort of the meaning of life. So these are uncertainties about the child's survival and the degree to which SCID will define the child and the family's life. So this parent says, I mean, the biggest one, I didn't know if our baby was going to live. This is just clearly uncertainty about whether the child will survive. And we'll show examples of other variations of that moving forward as well. I wanted to share this diagram. This is showing sort of the number of times that we heard these types of uncertainty come up across the journey as we interviewed parents. You can see here that medical uncertainty, so the orange bar, remained the highest, the most dominant form of uncertainty across the whole journey. Although, as you can see, it greatly decreased, highest early in the journey, of course, as families are grappling with what the diagnosis means and what caused it and what the treatment should be, but continues into the post-treatment and new normal stage as in the form of just worrying about the child's prognosis and their longer-term medical health. But the other uncertainties that we just talked about, personal, practical, they are there across the journey, and you can see that, you know, in the new normal where families are back home, those personal and personal and practical uncertainties are higher and closer to being, you know, equal with medical uncertainty. And then finally, existential uncertainty. So that deep, you know, uncertainty about survival and what SCID means for the child and the family's life. It's highest at the very beginning of the journey, as you might expect, just getting this news about SCID, you know, being a possibility and then having it confirmed. There's that fear, that uncertainty about the child's survival, but really the existential uncertainty, you can see, remains throughout the whole journey and into the new normal. So even when families are home and have been home for many years, there still is this existential uncertainty of what is the outcome of the child's life, and what that means. So what we see is that uncertainties do tend to evolve or change over the journey. Medical and personal uncertainties become less prominent, although they're still there in the new normal stage. And although existential uncertainty does decline over the course of the journey from the very beginning, when that first, you know, the parents get the call about newborn screening and in the diagnosis, it does decline after that, but it persists and it overlaps with and can compound other uncertainties. So this phenomenon of existential uncertainty overlapping with and compounding other types of uncertainty is actually pretty, it was a surprising finding for us. And it really speaks to what a unique journey SCID is, that it is receiving a call that your child has a life-threatening condition. And then, you know, there's hope of a treatment, but the treatment, depending on what it is, may be invasive or even life-threatening. And then the treatments and the newborn screening for the condition are new enough that families and medical providers haven't necessarily, you know, seen further than 20 or 30 years into the future. And that breeds uncertainty about long-term outcomes which persist. So we felt like this was really important to look into how parents are managing that, and in the hopes that it might help other parents who are just embarking on the journey. So we're going to dig a little bit more into what exactly existential uncertainty looks like and how parents are coping with it. So I've given some previous examples, but these are just existential uncertainty is these questions of will my child survive? How much will SCID define my child's life? Will my child be okay? Will my child have a normal life in the future? Will my child be able to be happy and fulfilled even if something about SCID is affecting them in the future? These are the types of things that our parents are grappling with. And in our interviews, we saw it experienced by parents in different ways. A predominant way that it was expressed was fear and anxiety, feeling traumatized, overwhelmed, having sadness, but we also did hear parents expressing optimism and hope. So this is an example of existential uncertainty overlapping with practical uncertainty. I'm going to offer a couple of these examples just to give an idea of what this phenomenon looks like in SCID parents, and then hopefully show some examples of how they manage it. So this parent says, I was afraid that if we'd wait too long before treatment, something that I would do at home, for instance, if I didn't come home and clean correctly or something, I would get her sick and she would die. So this is a parent in the pre-treatment stage. The child hasn't been treated yet. Really just, dealing with something as basic as needing to go out and take care of things outside of the home and clean the home. Like many parents have that, on their radar. But then in the midst of that, having this fear that doing something wrong in that basic, sphere of taking care of life could actually cause the death of their child. This is an example of existential uncertainty overlapping with medical uncertainty. So the parent says, I didn't know anything about SCID, and my initial reaction to the diagnosis was just fear of losing her and fear of never seeing her grow up. So this is a medical uncertainty. Receiving any kind of diagnosis would it potentially trigger someone having medical uncertainty about what the diagnosis means. And on top of that, this parent is dealing with uncertainty about their child's survival. This is existential uncertainty overlapping with personal uncertainty. So this parent says, we always worry, is that going to kill our baby by him working? It's taken one of the biggest tolls on my other kids. They don't get to have friends over. So this mom is describing how her husband has to work out of the home, which gives them worry and concern, uncertainty for the child's health. And in addition, because of wanting to protect the child who has SCID, having this uncertainty about the well-being of the other children who don't get to have social interactions. So those are some powerful and heavy examples. I'd like to transition now to showing you some ways that parents described managing or coping with their uncertainty, hopefully to provide some hope. The SCID community is incredibly resilient, and we saw a lot of this in our interviews with parents. So there are 3 types of coping. And again, this comes from the literature and research on coping over broadly, not just with SCID. But these were the 3 types of coping that we saw most prominently in the interviews with parents. So the first is behavioral coping, and that's changing one's or doing something, behaviors, to try to manage uncertainty. Then cognitive coping is trying to change the way one thinks to manage uncertainty. And affective coping is trying to change the way one feels to cope with uncertainty. So I'm going to give examples of each of these in the next few slides. So a few examples of behavioral coping. Again, these are behaviors, something that the parent is doing to try to better manage their uncertainty. So the first is playing an active role in treatment decisions. We also saw having important conversations with one's partner, and seeking SCID-related information. And I'll give an example of each of these. So the first, having important conversations with one's partner. This parent says, we could kind of separate ourselves from what was happening and talk about it in almost like a third-person perspective. I think it was just easy for us to think of it as a moment in time that it was eventually going to be different. So this parent is talking about actively engaging in these conversations with the partner that were helpful. Next, active seeking of SCID-related information. So this parent is describing a Google search looking on the internet. It says, we were trying to learn about what we were facing, searching desperately for an alternative that was not a death sentence. So this act of looking for information was helping them manage the uncertainty that they were having. And this, I believe, would have been in the diagnosis phase of the journey. And then thirdly, playing an active role in treatment decisions. So this parent is describing sort of grappling with the decision about whether to do an experimental treatment, and says, that's a big thing with chemotherapy. Children tend to become infertile. So we made that decision and we didn't go back and forth. So they researched their decision, they made their decision, and being a part of the treatment decision helped them manage that uncertainty. And just to point out too that the existential piece here of this uncertainty is not just always survival. It's also looking at the child's quality of life in the future and wondering if, you know, their child will be able to have children one day and how that will affect them. So this is an example of sort of a different angle of existential uncertainty and how it was managed. Cognitive coping, again, this is trying to change the way one thinks to manage uncertainty. So a few examples that were prominent in the interviews we did with parents: ability to talk to or lean on one's partner, focusing on the positive, focusing on what's actionable or controllable, and placing trust in the medical team. So first, placing trust in the medical team. This parent says, our goal was to make sure he would survive. The medical team was saying that with transplant, he had a 95% chance to survive. It seemed the better of the options. So taking that information that they received from the medical team and then trusting in that and making a decision based on it was helping them manage. Focusing on what's actionable or controllable. This parent is sort of, you know, putting forth some existential questions. Is he going to have a normal life? Is he going to have long-term side effects of chemotherapy? Now we're just focusing on how well he's doing and keeping him on his path. So this parent's, you know, acknowledging that these questions exist, but saying, like, you know, the child is doing well. We're trying to keep him doing well, and that's what we can control right now, and that's helping them manage. And then ability to talk to or lean on one's partner. So this parent says, I think we were just scared and unsure what life would be for her or for us. It was my husband and I trying to just figure it out and talk to the doctors and just go from there. So in contrast to when we were looking at behavioral coping, this parent isn't necessarily describing talking to their partner. It's not an action. It's just sort of being in it with somebody else and not being alone, and being able to lean on the partner is something that's helping them manage the uncertainty. And then focusing on the positive. This parent says, every once in a while, I think, well, what happens when he gets to be 40? Is he going to be okay? And then I think maybe he can get gene therapy by then. So this parent's grappling with those uncertainties about what the child's life will be like, and then focusing on the positive that medical advances might mean that there's something there to facilitate the child doing better at that time. Finally, I'll share some examples of affective coping. So again, this is trying to change one's feelings to cope with uncertainty. A few examples we saw: one is limiting the amount of information one takes in. Another is active self-care. And the third is to stop feeling sorry for oneself. So limiting the amount of information. This parent says, I had to stop looking at Facebook for a while we were inpatient because there were a lot of very tragic things happening to some kids while I was inpatient. And just seeing some of that heartbreak, it was not helpful at the time. So this parent is acknowledging that seeing what was happening with other SCID families was causing her sadness and uncertainty and anxiety, and then choosing to limit that information at the time to cope with the uncertainty of her own experience. As you can see here, this is the parent's words, not ours, but this affective coping of stop feeling sorry for oneself. So this parent says, in the back of our mind, we were like, okay, you know what? There's a non-zero chance that he may not pull through. At the same time, we knew we couldn't feel sorry for ourselves too much because we had other children to take care of. So this, sort of parents exhibiting some control over what they're allowing themselves to feel for the sake of focusing on taking care of their other children. And finally, active self-care. So this parent says, I started taking melatonin at night because if I don't sleep, I'm no good to anyone. And with all this stress, it's hard to sleep and all you do is worry. If I hear anything, I'm jumping up, checking his temperature. Does he have a fever? And if he does have a fever, I'm up all night. So I'm definitely for taking care of yourself and going to sleep. So this parent is acknowledging how she feels when she doesn't get enough sleep and making an active decision to manage her uncertainties by making sure that she takes care of herself in these specific ways that she's realized. I wanted to share the next quote that I'm going to share is really showing that parents, we heard them say in our interviews, how they learn over time what is working for them, and they, they do it again. They see what's working and then they keep doing that, or they use self-reflection and identify what's not working and change what they're doing. So this is a really powerful and positive example of sort of a parent being able to change how they're feeling and how they're managing uncertainty over time. The parent says, that's why I try to think positive, because when I was so negative, nothing was working out for us. Nothing was good when I was negative. So I just decided to be positive, and I would wake up and just start our day, put on some music, me and my child would dance. We would just do anything to have a good day. And just slowly, my mind just became less cloudy and started thinking more clearly. And that's when I became very self-aware of my feelings, how I react to things, and how I decide to go with whatever's thrown my way. So you see here this parent, sort of starting out in one place where they're feeling very negative and, describe even feeling cloudy, and deciding to be positive and doing it again and again. And then over time, really having a change in their attitude and in their outlook. So there really is a lot of hope that we heard from parents in terms of how they were able to, take this unexpected situation and turn it into, something that they were adapting and moving forward and making the best life that they could for their family. I love this brief quote at the top of the slide here, and it was definitely the sentiment was common. I learned a strength I never knew I had. So, parents screen positive for SCID through newborn screening and embark on a complex journey. Although we have a pretty diagram, there really is no map. And we interviews that existential uncertainties are there throughout the journey, but they do diminish over time, and that parents learn strategies to cope with them. And parents can even come to experience uncertainty as an opportunity for personal growth. So we really are excited to share this and felt that it's important to do this work and share this because parents may find hope in learning the ways that other parents have managed and cope with their uncertainties, particularly these existential ones that we know span the entire SCID journey. So even though every SCID journey is unique, the hope is to, in terms of next steps, to take these experiences that parents shared and use them to develop resources to help other parents, or even just sharing these stories, hopefully offering hope to other parents who are on the journey. We will have a time for questions. First, really a heartfelt thanks to all of the parents who participated in these interviews, who are willing to recount and relive some painful memories for the sake of this work that is meant to help other SCID parents. So we really appreciate their vulnerability and their time and their willingness to talk to us. Also want to thank IDF and SCID Compass partners and our colleagues at RTI who worked very hard on the interviews with parents, the analysis, and this presentation. Angela Gwaltney, Oksana Kutza, and Erin Maloney. And of course, acknowledging that we appreciate the funding of HRSA for this work. Before I shift to questions, Melissa or Barb, do you have anything to add? Oh, hold on, Barb, are you trying to talk, Barb? You might be muted. If I can unmute you.
I think I'm unmuted now. If I could just add that I think that was a great representation of the interviews, Sarah, so thank you so much. One of the things that I always like to say about coping is that we do it instinctively. All of us face stress in our lives at various times, and obviously small stresses don't come close to what SCID parents go through. So these are extreme circumstances, but that leads to tremendous stress. But what's amazing is that all of us have the ability to find different ways to manage that stress, which we call coping mechanisms. But there's nothing fancy or formal about it. Most of us, when we end up in difficult circumstances, you can just reflect back on COVID, are able to reflect or just instinctively act in certain ways that help us manage uncertainties. So there's nothing magical about it, but sometimes we choose things that aren't as helpful in managing uncertainties as other times. And that's what I think is always wonderful to capture in interviews like these, where people exemplify, they realize as they're talking in the interview, well, you know, I actually wasn't managing it very well, but then I was. And they're able to talk about whether it was a deliberate switch or an instinctive switch or whatever. So I just think it's heartening to keep in mind that we all have the ability to cope even when it's really difficult.
I'm sorry, everyone. I got kicked out of Zoom, but I'm back.
It was perfect timing, just when Barb finished.
I did see, I'm going to check the chat. I saw a couple of comments come through while I was talking. I wanted to make sure that we address any questions that have already been put forth.
Also, I think it's important to add that you know, circumstances can be so difficult, especially early on, that people are truly exhausted and depressed. And when that's true, it is much harder to cope. So even though we have the ability and the resources to cope, it doesn't mean that, you know, at any point in any day, you can just click your fingers and find something that works for you. So I don't mean to minimize that sometimes it can be really, really hard to cope.
Yes, thank you. We did have some questions that came up in the chat. One person said, did any parents mention PTSD? If so, were these feelings or triggers greater around certain areas of uncertainty? That's a great question. Yes, parents did mention PTSD. I can't tell you with certainty how many times that came up. I didn't mention this in the presentation, but we did ask parents specifically about uncertainty surrounding COVID-19. And that was one instance that I remember it coming up as, you know, as many of you experienced, having to go back into isolation and worry about sickness and germs in a way that was familiar. I know that that was described, at least by one parent, if not more, as sort of triggering some PTSD. And I think also I do remember now hearing about it from a parent who had a specific experience, you know, in their past. So it was sort of an unusual circumstance too, but definitely related to COVID-19. We have another question. Did you hear of any supports that parents would like to see from newborn screening programs? That's a great one too. I would say that across the board, universally, if not everybody, almost everybody had a pretty traumatic phone call about newborn screening results. Not always, but many times they were hearing from a primary care doctor who didn't know what SCID was. And so it left them with, I think, additional uncertainty, and then had to wait a period of days before they could meet with a specialist who could give them more information. And everybody was told not to Google it. But that is just, I think, what we heard was that was pretty impossible. And so they were Googling it. So I think that in terms of the newborn screening system and the series of events that have to occur, someone can't necessarily see a specialist the next day, but parents did talk about a need or a desire for different handling of the situation early on, or being given more information, at least, so that they didn't feel that they had to go and Google what was happening. Barbara, Melissa, do you remember anything else that I left out?
It's Melissa. I would just add that, as Sara was mentioning kind of at the beginning of the talk, we actually did a complimentary survey to the parent survey with providers. And we did hear from providers who said it would be really helpful if we had some talking points or more information, as you were just saying, Sara, around how to share, mostly from those who hadn't had a patient with SCID before, how to share those newborn screening results with families, or where to go for information, or where to send parents for information, for that matter. So we'll be working over the next several months with the SCID Compass team around developing some additional resources for providers that will really complement, as Alyssa was sharing in the opening session, that SCID fact sheet for parents, materials for providers as well. So we're hoping to have kind of a whole suite of information for both parents and providers that will really help with not only that initial screen positive and confirmatory testing stage, but throughout the SCID journey. So
great. I'm sorry that I identified you, Dr. Ostrander, but I think it's important because this is some medical advice, which I am not able to provide. So Dr. Ostrander said, I would encourage parents who are struggling despite supports and counseling to talk with their primary care physician. Prolonged stress changes the brain, and sometimes medication for anxiety and depression is an important component. So that's a great point. If parents are continuing to struggle, please reach out to your primary care doctor or a counselor for help.
Absolutely.
And I don't know if Free is on, but maybe if she is, she could mention the other virtual support groups that SCID Compass is going to be offering. Hate to put you on the spot, Free, if you're there.
She might need one of us.
She might need to be unmuted
if she is, yeah.
I think I can ask to unmute you. Let me see if I can do that, Free.
Perfect. Yeah, so I think, great. Hi, everyone. So I'm Free. I'm the virtual care associate with SCID Compass. So we have an offering coming up. We have peer support groups, and they're going to be based off of regions. And of course, they are virtual. And the groups are going to be guided by group facilitators who perhaps have some mental health counseling or licensures. And so we're really excited to get it started. Please look out for an email. Actually, early next week, we'll be sending out an email with some more information and details about it. And if you have any specific questions, please reach out to me. I'm going to put my email in the chat.
Great.
Thanks, Free.
Great resource.
Any other questions? Please feel free to put them in the chat, or if you would like to speak, I can unmute you.
I will just add that we do hope to publish our results from these interviews, and I think they'll have a broader reach, hopefully with providers as well as other families. And obviously Sara had limited time to present the results. There'll be many more findings. These were extensive interviews, and I think we'll have a lot of opportunity to share what the parents have shared with us.
Mm-hmm. Indeed. Well,
Sara, sorry, I was going to have one more plug. Just reflecting on some of the other uncertainties that you presented kind of earlier beyond the medical or beyond the existential uncertainties is the medical uncertainties. That was certainly, as you saw in that early graphic, a prevalent uncertainty, not surprisingly, for families across the SCID journey. One of the other sets of resources that we've been working on is help and information around what is conditioning. So I think Sara shared one of the quotes around, the treatment decision around whether or not the child would receive preconditioning or conditioning kind of during the pre-treatment stage of the journey. So the team has been working with parents and the steering committee, and are in the final stages of putting a great set of resources on the SCID Compass website, just to provide more information for parents around the frequently asked questions, if you will, around conditioning. So look for that coming soon too.
Yes. Awesome. Well, if there are no other questions, we thank all of you very much for coming. Again, thank you to the parents. If any of you are out there in the audience, we appreciate you so much. And please feel free to reach out to us if any questions. Oh, if people are still here, we have a comment from a parent saying, just a note of encouragement, these uncertainties we experience as SCID parents, I would argue, make us more present, more loving, and more patient parents. The way I approach motherhood now after experiencing these fears is the greatest gift. Thank you so much. That's wonderful. A beautiful way to end our presentation.
Yeah. Thank you.